Authority over Rabbinic Law, we planned tonight's event quite some time ago. I would say probably 2 months ago, 2.5 months ago, we planned it. We had no idea that some of this topic would be relevant for current events. That was not part of the planning, but sometimes God works wonders. And it turns out that tonight's conversation is timeless and about ideas of Torah that are always, it's also very timely. The larger question of Rabbinic Authority, its scope and its limitations, how we view Rabbinic Authority, is a question of perennial interest. Tonight, we're primarily going to study Torah. We're studying a sugya that appears in the second perek of the Rambam and Hilchos Nachem. It comes from Gemaras in Avodah Zarah, Daf Lamed Vav. Just briefly, the Gemara tells us that there was a prohibition of shemen shel nochrim, that the oil of non-Jews was forbidden. And then at some point in history, and it's not clear when, there is a Gersology issue, whether it was at the time of Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi or at the time of Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi's grandson, Rabbi Yehuda Nasiya, they eradicated that prohibition. And the Gemara raises the question, how can you eradicate a prohibition that existed beforehand? On the one hand, we know that rules that are instituted by the Chachamim, despite the fact that the reason for the law no longer applies, but the law remains intact. So it would seem that you can never get rid of a rabbinic prohibition. On the other hand, you have a Mishnah videos that we'll be studying together this evening, where the Mishnah says that if you have a person that's gadol v'chachmo b'minyan, you have a person that's greater in wisdom and in number, whatever that means. The Rishonim dispute the definition of those terms, but a greater person has the ability to uproot an enactment of a lesser person. On the third hand, and most of us only have two, but we still have to have a third hand here. On the third hand, there are times that you can uproot a rabbinic enactment simply because it doesn't apply anymore. Simply because the reason why the Chachamim instituted that rule is no longer germane. It doesn't apply. And of course, this leads to so many questions. Questions that we'll be discussing later tonight in terms of taking medicine on Shabbos, in terms of dancing, etc. And we could go on to dozens of issues, but we have limited our conversation to only a few. And as a result, I hope that what we'll do is we'll bring you all into this conversation. Now, two disclaimers. One, any extrapolation from today's conversation to current events has to be done with the necessary understanding that we're only talking about one tiny piece of the discussion. We're talking about one small sugya. Anything that's going on in the world, any issue in current events, necessarily impacts on many different sugyas. This particular sugya that we're discussing tonight is extremely complex. The Rambam and the RIETS did totally different ways of looking at it. Not to mention, and we're not even getting into the various positions of Tosfos in various locations. So the sugya is complex. It's difficult. Any extrapolation has to recognize that if this one sugya, this one isolated aspect of this part of the conversation is so complex, certainly when we try to look at the entire issue, which impacts on so many different sugyas, each of which is complex, so we have a lot of work that's cut out for us. Obviously, I have to give a disclaimer that, I trust Rabbi Wieder. I trust Rabbi Klapper tremendously. These are massive Talmidei Chachamim, people of tremendous integrity and scholarship. But I am not, we're having a conversation tonight, a conversation in learning, which means that there might be ideas that come out of this conversation that I don't agree with. And I don't want to have to say that I don't agree with everything. We want the conversation to keep on going. The goal is it should be an interesting and an enlightening conversation. So the disclaimer is that I hope to agree with everything that is said, but inevitably there are going to be some disputes, and inevitably I'm not going to agree with everything. And the disclaimer is, no, I don't agree with everything that will be said. So there it goes. Basically, I think I'm done with my introduction, and I'd like to hand the mic over to Rabbi Wieder and to Rabbi Klapper, and we'll begin this conversation. The format is going to be relatively simple. Rabbi Wieder and Rabbi Klapper will make their general introduction. I may interject a bit, but I'm inclined to allow the conversation to develop its own life, and at the end, I will follow up and summarize and open the floor to the audience for a few questions and perhaps ask a few questions of my own. So, Rabbi Tai, Rabbi Basha.
First, I just ask someone to push the agree button on that. That would be awesome. Thank you. I thank Rabbi Schwartz for the wonderful introduction, and Rabbi Wieder for agreeing to be here. And it is both a privilege and honor to be on a panel. Though they don't need my Haskama for their scholarship, but also really wonderful friends and Baalei Chesed, I can say personally. I'm very, very grateful for that, and really looking forward to it with them. So I thought it would be valuable to begin by taking a few sentences to talk about what halakha d'Rabbanan is and why we have it. Why do we have such a category called halakha d'Rabbanan? From two perspectives. One, why isn't the Torah comprehensive? Why do we have a category of halakha that isn't included? And two, what gives us the chutzpah to make laws and then claim that God enforces, that God intends them to be enforced? I want to start. Those, I think, are fundamental questions that we have to ask if we want to think about how halakha d'Rabbanan should and should not be changed, what kind of authority we have over them. I think it's important to try and think about why it exists in the first place. And I want to set out three possible axes to think about the distinction between halakha d'Rabbanan and halakha d'Oraita. The first of those is ontological, that there is a fundamental difference in kind between halakha d'Oraita and halakha d'Rabbanan, and that's expressed lumdishly in two ways. In halachic lumdus, this is framed as saying that halakha d'Oraita is a mitzvah in the Chefza, and halakha d'Rabbanan is a mitzvah in the Gavra. In somewhat more theological lumdus, the way of framing it is to say that you cannot violate a mitzvah d'Rabbanan b'shogeg, because what's wrong when you violate mitzvah d'Oraita is that you did something wrong. The act itself tears a fabric tears a hole in the fabric of the universe. What you did wrong was you went against the will of the rabbis, and so if you didn't intend to go against the will of the rabbis, nothing happened because the action itself is not wrong. So that's one axis, what I would call the ontological axis. There's a second axis, which I think is really very interesting. It only exists, so far as I know, really only in one figure, Rav Yaakov Kamenetsky, Zichrono Livracha, who in his commentary on Pirkei Avot, on the first, the Mishnah says, "Vasus Yagla Torah," that Yachak Knesset built a fence around the Torah. So he says, you see from here that until Yachak Knesset Agdola, there were no fences around. Zerot, Siagim, that preventive laws designed to protect Torah laws are a creation of the post-First Temple era, and the implication seems to be that they are a reaction or a compensation to a change in the nature of the religious experience. A third possibility is a purely formal thing, which is to say that it's not that the reason we say something is because that the Oraisas are different in nature, and therefore they intrinsically are more machmir, the Rabbanan are more megil, but that actually the rabbis have lots of discretion as to whether to frame their laws, their legal decisions as interpretations of Torah, which they call deoraita, or as attempts to protect Torah, which they call Rabbanan. And the reason for assigning them to one category or the other is that you wish to have applied to them the rule, Safek deoraisa l'chumra or Safek deoraisa l'kula. Now that possibility is the most radical in terms of our topic, because it might be that the reason halakha is assigned to the Rabbanan deoraisa category, that the formal thing that interests us is not Safek, but the question of the nature of the mechanism necessary to overturn it. and the degree of authority to which subsequent human beings will have over the nature of that law. So I want to set those out as possible frameworks for thought, and if the reader has comments, I'm happy to.
I think we can move on to the details.
Okay, good. So now we're going to details. You want to I'm efficient.
Okay.
So it'd be more efficient.
So perhaps Rabbi Klapper is as generic about Kodesh is more focused on the broader concepts, and I'd like to start focused on the details. I'm going to read first of the 4 issues that the Rambam raises in terms of how to change law. And the first of the 4 is the only one that is straight oraisa. The other 3 are kinds of rabbinic enactments. So the Rambam is the following statement, and this is perhaps somewhat surprising. We tend to think of oraisa law as revealed and unchanging. The Rambam, who has already laid out in the first part of Hilchos Mamrim the notion that there are really fundamentally 2 different kinds of Torah Sheba'al Peh. The first kind is that which is revealed at Sinai, coming either in the form of halacha Moshe Sinai's or Perushim HaMikubalim, perceived interpretations, and those fundamentally are unchanging. But then the Rambam has an understanding that there's another category of Dinam D'Oraisa, and those that are the product of the interpretation of the various salvations. And it's with regard to that set of laws that the Rambam essentially applies the famous Mishnah in Rosh Hashanah of Yiftach B'Doro Tishko B'Doro. It says the following: Based in Godol Shedarshu Ma'achas and Hamidos, Kefima Shenira Beinehem, Shahadin Kach, the Danu Din. If a based in Hagodol, the Sanhedrin has interpreted using one of the hermeneutical methods of interpretation according to what they see fit, that they determine the halacha to be such. The Amar Achareim based in Acher, and then a subsequent based in the later generation arises. The Nira Lo Tam Acher Listorosa. They believe that that interpretation is the subsequent basin is allowed to overturn that interpretation and interpret the Torah very much the way you might understand a Supreme Court interpreting the Constitution. They can interpret the Torah according to that they see fit. Shenemar El HaShofein Asher Yeh Bayomim Hahem Ein Chachai V'Leches El Acher. Only follow based in your generation. To this I would add simply, I think, 2 comments. Number 1, the Rambam omits any requirement of a based in Gadol Chachma of a minute. Does not seem to have any specific requirement that the subsequent based in, which is overturning the oraisa interpretation of an earlier based in, be greater in wisdom than whatever meaning exactly means. The second comment, which is not explicit in the Rambam, but I think is a given, and I think it's true throughout the discussion, I'm not sure if Klapper agrees fully, or in all the instances, is that it requires another based in, it requires another Sanhedrin. So you don't require a subsequent Sanhedrin to be Gadol B'Chachma of a minyan, but you do require what one might term a minyan acher. You require another based in, having the same basic authority of the interpretation of Scripture to overturn an earlier D'Oraisa.
Sure. Okay. You think I should hold comments on the first one?
Whatever
we can, so let's sort of report it. We've been talking about how we had a conversation Thursday night on the phone about some of these we covered already. So if you read the first paragraph of the note, it says Beitin Gadol Shedarshu Dachat and Hamidot, and after it says the Amalach Beitin. And the question is whether the absence of, and the second clause is means to say, or the second one, the intent is to say that even a Sanhedrin can be overturned by a non-Sanhedrin, but whether the Gadol in the second paragraph is implicit. This, I believe, is a machloket between Rabbi Yochanan Wasserman and the Chazon Ish, in which Rabbi Yochanan Wasserman says that it has to be Beitin Gadol. The Chazon Ish rather disappointed Rabbi Yochanan by writing it to him and saying that it didn't have to be. But it's actually useful for our conversation, because that seems to suggest that the Chazon Ish believe 3 men forming a debate, they can overturn all of Midrash Halacha whenever they want. And in fact, at one point used to walk into my shir and say, well, now we've learned this, so which one do you want to start with? I get different. But they've said, this is really very valuable, but they've said that, however, I think that is very valuable. That will show up in our own discussion. Second category. Beit Din shegezer gzeira takana, particularly takana b'higumina. So Beit Din that established 8 kinds of law. What we call a siyag, which is an extension of the existing or preventive to correct an existing halakha d'oraita. A takana is a response to social circumstances, as opposed to a universal extension of the of an existing law. And I'm not at all sure what it's in some ways spread, bracketing for the moment the question of not spread if Rabbinic authority is absolute and everyone does exactly what the rabbis say. How could you ever have a circumstance where Beit Din says that? Apparently it does sometimes happen. It didn't happen in this case. The Mana Beit Din affair. Now another Beit Din arises. The mission itself has no context for that to tell you what is referred. Rambam chooses to make that statement that you require a greater Beit Din to apply only to the Rabbanan and not to Joraisas. And he seems to be deliberately giving human beings authority. And then the writing goes further. Amar Abraham, lo afilu liyahu Beit Dinu, lo pashat. Or the native accent is here. So the Rivet says that the Rambam is too latitudinarian. The Rambam allows for too much of a possibility of overturning the law, and he believes that at least the Gzeira, once it has spread throughout all Israel, can never be overturned at all. Halachot Rabbanan that have spread are absolutely permanent, unlike, because the Rabbi doesn't disagree with Rambam's first paragraph, unlike halachot d'oraita which are flexible. And then we go on to say, even if you have one of the two characteristics, you are still completely stopped from in any way uprooting a decree made by a prior Beit.
The next category, which the Rambam will introduce, before we talk about it, I want to just sort of go back very quickly to the sources in Chazal that sort of present the possibilities. There is a Mishnah in Abios which speaks about the requirement of Gadol Chachma over Minyan. That you cannot overturn the ruling of a previous Beis Din unless it is Gadol Chachma over Minyan. There's also a Gemara, I believe the Zara Davar, Zeros that were made by Beis Shammai over the will of Beis Shammai cannot be overturned by anybody. That's the reference that the Rabbi made Afilu and the Yeho Beis Dino. Those are the only two very clear categories that both Rambam and the Rabbi agree to. Number one, that there are things that no Beis Din can overturn, and number two, there are things that Beis Din, in order to overturn a previous Beis Din's ruling, must be greater than Chachma over Minyan. There's a third Gemara, but the circumstances of the Gemara are not clear, which I think, however, will form a major focus of our discussion, is the Sugya Beitza. The Sugya Beitza speaks about Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai uprooting an earlier takana. The takana had been made not to redeem fruits of Ravai within a certain radius of Yerushalayim, so that people would bring the fruits to Yerushalayim, and that the shuk of Shukei Yerushalayim would be decorated with Paris. And the Korban, obviously, on a principle level, this was not necessary. And the Gemara says that Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai uprooted, was Levatel, or did something for that takana. The question that the Gemara there in that sugya simply uses the expression davar she'b'minyan tzarich achar minyan achar la'atira. And the question, one of the central questions in interpretation has to be, is this a third principle, a third area of halacha, which is that anything that was decreed by a beis din simply needs another beis din to overturn it, but regardless of chacham of minyan, in which case it would be sort of a third category. We have number one, things that no beis din can overturn; number two, things that you require gadol chacham of minyan; and three, things that only require minyan acher. Or perhaps this Gemara is actually dealing with the situation of gadol chacham of minyan. Perhaps Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai was greater; he and his beis din were greater than an earlier beis din, and we're simply overturning it. So the Rambam writes here now, afilu batal hatam shebeglala gadol. Even if the reason for the original hakana, zera, whatever it is, even if that reason is no longer applicable, it would appear, according to the Rambam, that he's probably referring to the Sugya Beta, not definitely, but very possibly, and he understands that that Gemara, assuming that Yochanan ben Zakkai was Gadol b'Chacham of minyan, and that's why he was able to overturn the hakana. In the Rabbinic, in which case, for the Rambam, there are only two categories. There's things that require Gadol b'Chacham of minyan, and there are things that no beis din can overturn. But it comes along the Rabbinic, he says, Amar Avram iter shukei Yerushalayim b'Peiros kash Allah. Sharisha Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai bitla achar churban, ibnei shenisnatal hatam harishonim, v'lo hayagadol harishonim. The Rabbinic says that the Gemara Beitza proves in effect that this is some type of a third category. He assumes, and this is perhaps a rebuttable presumption, that Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai was inferior with his beis din to the earlier generation, and yet he overturned a takana of a previous beis din. It seems a simple interpretation of the Rabbinic, and I think that will form some of our basis of some of our discussion subsequently, is that when the reason for Ezra is still applicable, then it either falls under the category of the Yud Chestaver, which no beis din can revoke, or it falls under the requirement of Gadol b'Chacham of Vida is required. However, when the reason for the Gzeira is batal, so then you require simply any minyan, even an inferior minyan, as Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai did when he made hakana of the earlier beis din. I think we can probably skip the next line. You want to take over?
Sure. So yeah, and I apologize for I put the question mark after the wrong word. But an Ezra number, right? In what context were the previous words the Rambam said, where the Rambam suggested that at least a Beit Gadol b'Chachma Minyan could overturn prior to Rabbinic Law? So I confess that I haven't the faintest idea what this sentence means at all.
I was going to ask you actually what you think the distinction between type A and type B is. I asked Rabbi Schwartz now because I've learned this for years, and I don't understand how do you distinguish between the guys.
Right, because type A is
in other words, when the Rambam says in the first line, "Shadazun zera tikut takana v'tikum what's the difference between that, where you need Gadol b'Chacham of the minyan, and what Rabbi Klapper is about to read of Dvarim Sharobes and Ligzor L'Asur L'Asur Siyag? Isn't every Gzeira Siyag?
He seems to have four categories, right?
Yes, I mean, again, this last category seems to be the Rambam is formulating the Yud Chestaver.
Right. Yes. Right. So I think that there are there's a famous Tosfos. I think in Gittin claims that the Yud Chestaver are only those 18 things because the Moshe broke out of those. Right here, the Rambam sees Yud Chestaver that you can never revoke as some type of a broader category. It's a type. But I want to know, I hope that you were going to tell me what is this type. It doesn't matter.
I think we're all agreed. This is and I can tell you what I think Yud Chestaver are, but I can't fit into the words of the Rambam. So that doesn't, right? So I can't claim that anything I think the Rambam says. Yud Chestaver seem to be specifically framed around non-Jews, right? But not all of them. All of them, many of them. Right? But they seem to be reactions to particular historical social circumstances.
Right, but the first 9 that's of power.
I would still think that they're framed around specific historical social circumstances.
I just want to fill in the thought that things related to non-Jews was Akron and Shem and Akron and Stam Yenim and so on are part of the Yud Chestaver. Okay.
Yeah, so, but I have no way of fitting that into the Rambam, and I would have thought like Zera, Takana, and Dinah were a fairly comprehensive taxonomy of Rabbinic Law, and all of a sudden it pulls on us, right, on end or on the word, I have no idea what that means. And that he says, right, and so the machlokas on the right at this point appears to be that the Rabbi thinks that all of Israel, there's nothing you can do. And the Rambam thinks that's only true about this fourth category he calls a Kela Sil Torah. But the outcome of it, to me, is the key point, is that both the Rambam and the Rabbi seem to think it perfectly reasonable to say that the Oraita law is in essence permanent, and there's nothing you can do to limit the options of your successors in the Oraita law. But in the Rabbanan law, right, there's certainly a category of the Rabbanan law that you can, right, that they believe it seems that you can make absolutely permanent. And one should therefore be very, very cautious when making the Rabbanans. Because right, if you get something wrong about understanding the Torah, no big deal. Somebody else will fix it. But if you make a law that is unwise, you're stuck with it forever. And I have to say that to me, this seems very counterintuitive. And that's like my starting point for the whole question is, how can it be that the intent, how we set up a halachic system and claim was deliberately intended that the products of human intellect, which are inevitably responsive to particular circumstances, are permanent, and the interpretations of Baruch Hashem are perfectly flexible. You're still going to say the details? What's that? You're still going to say the details?
I don't have an answer to that question.
Okay.
So I'd like to talk about how it actually plays out.
Sure. Excellent.
I'm going to let you solve the theoretical problem.
I don't solve any problem. Why don't you say?
So I think the next focus, or sort of the shift, is to talk about, given the categories of halacha are sometimes changeable, sometimes not changeable. I would start by saying, maybe Rabbi Klapper would differ, but I think that the general working assumption of halachists since the close of the Talmud, or certainly since the beginning of the period of Rishonim, is that things that are found in the Gemara are treated as a davar shebedin. I would add, despite the fact that technically speaking, most of the Talmud Bavli was certainly not composed of any people who actually formed the official Sanhedrin. There was no Snichon Bavel, and even arguably, if I wanted to make a stronger argument, the last time there was a true Beis Din HaGadol in its full-fledged powers was in the year 30, before the Beis Din HaGadol exiled themselves from the Lishkas HaGazis. Once they leave the Lishkas HaGazis, and talking about a topic that Rabbi Klapper I know has much to say about, but not tonight, there was no longer a possibility of Zakin Mamre. So anyway, so at that point, this sort of presumably was a Sanhedrin functioning, and in Eretz Yisrael, it's not clear it was permanent. But certainly, the Talmud Bavli was not codified or redacted or sealed by a Beis Din. There was no Beis Din in Bavel. And nonetheless, the Rambam writes in his Hakdama to the Mishneh Torah that if a Beis Din makes a Gzera Kahana, other Bafei Din are not bound by it because basically authority is local. And that is assumed to be accepted by all of Klal Yisrael. So when push comes to shove, we tend to usually treat the Bavli as a davar shebedin. And the problem that we face sort of in subsequent generations is that we don't have another davar shebedin. We don't have an equivalent to the authority of the Bavli. And that's why I think the generally the working assumption throughout almost all of Tzah is things that are found in the Talmud are not under contemporary circumstances. Of course, there seem to be a number of exceptions, and that I think, to me, at least, is the central question. I personally, for myself, have considered it an issue that I've been searching for many years. What exactly is the rule? When do we say that some things, when do we say in effect, like Zera, and when do we not say it?
Okay. I think I'd say that I have no quarrels with the characterization that we treat the Bavli as absolutely binding. I'm not 100% sure that I fully agree with the claim that everything in the Bavli is automatically davar shebedin. I think this whole conversation started because I asked you last year what you wanted to talk about, and you said you were bothered by when something is davar shebedin and something isn't, right? And something isn't. So I was, as a reasonable presumption that that decrees which seem to be implicit in the background of the Bavli are treated as a davar shebedin, that's probably correct. But I think that that there are times when we look at it, the specific ideology of a decree down in the Bavli, and we say, we look at that, and that doesn't seem like it had a meaning associated with it. And I'm not sure that we're unwilling to take advantage of that on occasion.
I may respond just in one way. I think you can sort of take on that particular issue in one of two ways. I think you can argue that something in the Bavli wasn't the Davar Shabbat, or I would suggest later, although in a very, very limited sense, I know you're going to find this funny because this is not what I said in conversation, is that maybe there does exist some type of minion Islam has that, but I'll talk about how that might be. It will be for those who look at something rather disappointed, but nonetheless, I think there's two ways of looking at it.
Why don't you take the argument first anymore?
Okay, so I guess we'll start with the. So one particular. So if I may present a very brief, I guess I need to present a very brief background to this. The Mishnah Yaakov, which Shafter is very fond of quoting, has this notion that Shafter presents it, and others say some very similar things. There's a Rosh and Hilchos about this, that whether or not Ezra applies, when the reason no longer applies, depends upon whether or not the reason is really part of Ezra or was really separate from Ezra. And Shafter draws a video of when I can use the reason for a mitzvah found in the Torah to limit its application. And the position that he assumes is that we paskin that lo darshan time in the crop, like Rabbi Vida, but what comes along with that is that Rabbi Vida makes a distinction between two situations. When the Torah just gives us a mitzvah, a prohibition, and doesn't give us the Torah doesn't explicitly give us the reason, then the mitzvah always applies. However, if the Torah tells us the reason why, then whenever the reason applies, the mitzvah applies, but the reason doesn't apply, the mitzvah doesn't apply. So you say the same thing by Vida the Rabbanim. When the reason is part of the Ezra, it applies. When it's not, then when it applies, the Ezra applies, if not. If the reason is not part of the Ezra, then no matter what, the Ezra applies. Now, I am struck by the obvious difficulty of this suggestion, and there are similar suggestions made by a few others, which is, given that we know essentially the reason for essentially every din Rabbanan, almost every din Rabbanan, how do you know when the reason was part of the Ezra and when it was really sort of separate from the Ezra? We don't have the original proclamations that were issued by the various Sanhedrins. And I think that, I actually don't think that that's the sort of a workable approach, practically speaking, to understand. But more importantly, I wanted to spend 2 minutes to just focus on one sophia that I think demonstrates that it's not the case. And that's not what's going on. I found that Tosefta Shabbos, quoted in the first paragraph, he was not allowed to depart on a cruise within 3 days of Shabbos. Why? The Gemara doesn't say a single word. And yet, if you look at the Rishonim, you can collect 6 or 7 different interpretations as to why a mafli and Sfina. Now, if I had to pick one Zera Shas where we don't know the reason why, this would be certainly on the top of my list. And nonetheless, the amazing thing here is that not only are Chachmei Ashkenaz interpret this Gemara in such a way, classical Chachmei Ashkenaz, to justify communal non-observance of a din. People were going on goats 3 days before Shabbos. The Gemara says, the Brisa says that if it's the Dvar Mitzvah, it's mutter. If it's the Dvar Rishus, it's awesome. What is a Dvar Mitzvah? Rabbi Tam says business is a Dvar Mitzvah. You know what Dvar Rishus is? Going on a pleasure cruise. Now, I'm not an expert in medieval history, but I have the sense not too many Jews travel to seas on pleasure cruises in the period. Rabbi Tam Kodesh and the Balai are doing this students frequently. They are defending Minhag Yisrael, the Minhag of Kila Kedosh of Ashkenaz, what seems to be a violation of a din found in the Gemara. And they are saying that because this is all called the Bar Mitzvah, it's mutter. More amazing, but you don't expect this from Chachmei Sfarad, is that Rabbi Hananel says that if the Isra is about Talmud, it's about their in the Malam Yasar is the winner. That's why the so here even Chachmei, which is not characteristic, certainly early Chachmei Sfarad are no practice by explaining that the reason doesn't apply, so the Ezra doesn't apply. So I think this is an example. This is mind-boggling. So we really don't know what the reason for this is. So much so that you can have 7 opinions in the Rishonim. And yet, the reason doesn't apply, and the Xera doesn't apply. So I don't think, for me, it's difficult to understand this in light of some idea of whether the reason was part of the Xera or not, because, again, how do you know whether the reason was part of the Xera? I'll offer my suggestion later for what I think, but I want to let my happen.
Thank you, that's fascinating. And the analogy of Shepherd draws is also fascinating. Okay, yes. Really fascinating. So I should just say as a caveat that I don't think we must give Rosh and Talmud Crowd. I don't even think
I knew you would say that.
I don't even think such a sheet has ever existed. Which, I think that they're all that's a separate. But although it's relevant in the sense that Xera always, I think Xera always have rationales, and it's certainly true that we don't have the written record of just about any Xera, right? And even if we have a Xera, written record of a Xera, it wouldn't necessarily include the Tom. And then, as you know, even if it included the Tom, we might think that was a fake Tom, or we might think it was only one of the reasons, the sorts of reasons that I'm going to offer, that the reasons found in the Gemara are not the true reasons. And I think that's fairly compelling. The example that brought this home to me, I first learned this from a book, I believe it's called Zivchei Trua, by a Rabbi Weil in Lebron. And he just made a point which was really quite compelling to me. Why is it that we don't take the Arbanim on Shabbat? Because we're afraid that you're going to take your laws across the Rosh Hashanah Deoraisa to an expert lulav waiver who doesn't have their own lulav, but is an expert, right? So they can teach you how to. You couldn't have done this the day before. You somehow didn't imagine the possibility that the expert lulav waiver might. And right, what does it take to be an expert lulav waiver anyway? And it's really hard to find Rosh Hashanah Deoraisa. It's really hard. So it seems pretty clear that that is not actually the reason for the Xera. I would actually set out that there are, this will come later, there are 2 possible ways of understanding what the reason for Xera is. One of it is, probably useful if people knew before subsidiary causes, but I don't. And one of them is the reason that the Xera was made, and one of them is the formal rationale that explains the contours of the Xera. It's not why they made the Xera, but when you make a Xera, you often want it to follow the pattern of existing law. So I think that I endorse your notion that as it is, by the way, this is also true in terms of Talmud Krah, that trying to figure out whether there's a rationale in the Torah or not is very, and the lead case that the Gemara talks about is when you have key clauses, right? What does key mean? Is it giving a reason, right? A reason or not? So I think that's absolutely correct. The only problem is that we do have a category in the Rambam. The Rambam says afilu batla tam shebishvila batla zera. So we can say, well, we're just stuck with a black box. Right? So one plausible outcome is to say that since we cannot know the reasons of all Xera, therefore we can never make the claim that any Xera is null and void. Right? That's one outcome. And what you're pointing out is historically that wasn't the case. Right? And the issue is trying to figure out why that would be. Take it away. You want to talk about the mission of Why don't you talk about it?
The other, perhaps contemporary example, which is still a focus, I guess, still a focus on Krodim, is the question of Xera before on Shabbos. And here, as it prohibits the Gemara prohibit a whole series of practices. Most of them are ingesting various kinds of food, but there are even some non-food practices, which the Chachamim prohibited because the reason they give is because they prohibited various kinds of refuah. The reason given is Gizera Shema Yishachik Salamanim. I think it's still true today that most medicines are formulated with some act of grinding at some point, but most of us, I think, have never ground our medicines. We go to the pharmacy and it is taken care of. That is a very real concern that if you were permitted to engage in healing who is feeling slightly. So less than that or more than that, so the zero reform may not apply anymore. So the question is, what should there be? After all, it's probably fairly good bet that nobody in this room will say, I've done it, but almost nobody foods or spices in order to make their own medicines. And if that's the case, since they're generally formulated industrially, and it's not a concern that it should be a concern, if we let you take medicine on Shabbos, even from it, and come to grind it up, perhaps there shouldn't apply. And I think it's in the source sheets. So you will find sort of two different opinions there. Rosh is quoting the Rav, source 12 is indicating that the Rav thought that it remains asur. I should note at the same time, they're saying the name of the Rav and asked it is what you can take, I believe, because it's not Green, so I've heard said. On the other hand, there are a few achronim, source number 14, there are several achronim who want to argue that either under some or all circumstances, because we don't grind spices anymore, particularly Rabbinic the second paragraph in source 14, argues that the Ezra doesn't apply to us anymore. My sense is I could be wrong. Perhaps it's hard to know what people do. My sense, my answer to the question is that we assume, like Rabbi, that the Ezra is still in force. The only thing that I can say is that the scope of Ezra is somewhat narrow to start with, and based upon what one's interpretation of what Medrash Ba'alma is, may be quite narrow.
So, I think, first of all, I think one of the interesting things that shows up in the concept of Tchelet, which shows up again in medicine, is it might be that the homeopathic medicine, right, brings us back to this. And the interesting question is what constitutes a social norm and what doesn't constitute a social norm, maybe, right? And how do we deal with the reality that there are certain segments of society which grinding medicine, once again, seems to be, right, seems to be normal. But I think the question that's always interested me about Refuah of Shabbos is that generally we all pretty much get that is not really a concern. So let's take that as a given, that we're living in a world where it's not reasonable to say that the way to prevent people from grinding spices is to ban them, right, from taking medicine on Shabbat. So now what do we do? So we could say that this just boils down to a straightforward dispute. Either we keep the Gzeira exactly the way it was when Chazal made it, when that was really a concern, or we eliminate it. There's an intermediate possibility. The intermediate possibility is to say that we leave books, but we adopt every possible legal option. So we adopt the claim that it doesn't, right, that it doesn't apply to liquid medicines. We adopt the claim that it doesn't apply to medicines that need to be cooked. And what really brought this to a head to me was when the outbreak boss, Rabbi Joseph Pollack, told me once that there was no problem with Tylenol, not aspirin, not because it was matzel green, symptoms, and not underlying. He said it from his Rebbe, and I said, what? That kid's really like, is this distinction between treating symptoms and treating causes historically accurate, or what the Gemara taught on Sigron, does it treat causes, or does it, right? Anigron, do they treat causes? And then I discovered that this was a long pedigree. This is Eliezer. Right, quotes this as a perfectly respectful position. And to me, the most reasonable explanation of that is that there is a legal attitude which says that when there is a Gzeira that no longer, like whose rationale is we understand it, however it is that we come to the conclusion that we can understand the rationale for Gzeira. And when we reach that, and we reach the position that we understand the rationale for Gzeira, we do not believe the rationale for Gzeira applies. We don't have the authority to overturn it, but we are much more to adopt interpretations that
Can I just ask a question? Are you saying that like on a fundamental level, or is it based on Sirut Hashitos? In other words, are we saying that since we have a position of Chayam Noah, who assumes that it no longer applies, so we have an additional position that we can combine for leniency in cases of questionable illness?
So I am, I guess, the two things. One is I really like the formulation in source 14, but I can't vouch for it. where it says, "V'chein kata b'sefer Ktosah Shulchan Mazon Chaim Da'eh, the Gzeira Shchikat Samemanim Fil Tzvei Bizmanim." Right, this decree is lighter in our day. Not that this decree is banished in our day. Not there's a specific ground, right, for adopting a position. But there are areas in halakha in which one is allowed, for example, to adopt what we call a tartik asasri. There is halakha in which you're allowed to adopt conceptually contradictory positions, right? Because you like the outcome of each of these positions. So I'm suggesting, without going so far as to say that in the area of without going so far as to say that in the area of shchikas hamim, one can adopt explicitly contradictory positions, whatever those might be. But I'm suggesting that as a more broader rule, that when you have Ezra where there seems to be a consensus that its rationale no longer applies, that the proper derech hapsak, and derech hapsak that many poskim have adopted, is to choose the mekil position regarding the interpretation of the Ezra without necessarily adopting the same standard of textual and historical rigor that they might with regard to Ezra, whose rationale they think still does apply.
Just one other example, I think it's not on that category, is a position I don't think is generally adopted, or many it is used in combination with Sirah, is a position ascribed to Rosh regarding industrial bishul akum. So bishul akum was a xera that was made not to eat certain kinds of food cooked by non-Jews because of chasnas. Because if you eat their food, you'll come to know. It would seem that having Heinz baked beans, assuming there's nothing to trade from them, you're not likely to lead one. Pick your food. It's not likely to want to marry the Heinz's daughters. The very nature of food production today is very different than it once was. So Moshe suggests that perhaps the way food is prepared on an industrial scale was never the cloud that's there initial akum. So I think that's an example. I mean, obviously, I assume Moshe is responding, even though I don't think he formulated it this way. In fact, number one is probably a public benefit to this, and the reason that Ezra doesn't apply, but you can absolutely not ignore Ezra just because you think the reason doesn't apply. But in terms of defining the contours of Ezra, it looks to me like an example of Moshe choosing what is a very reasonable but sort of straight or narrow interpretation of what the Ezra itself was made on. I think that's somewhat in the same category. Just respond, Rabbi Schwartz, to your comment, because I suspect, but this is just my intuition, is that poskim rarely are thinking only in one sphere. I suspect that they're operating in multiple tracks, even if they only articulate one, and so they might be working with a combination of the two, even if they don't say it.
If I could just add, in terms of the bishul akum issue that Rabbi Wieder mentioned, I don't think, again, the source of this with Moshe is very hard to find. I believe that Rabbi Ephraim Greenland puts it in the Review of Ephraim. My understanding is that Rabbi Moshe is not saying that bishul akum is a position of maharitat out there, that bishul akum doesn't apply in industrial settings in general, just like this past palter, this concept of bishul palter, is rejected. What Rabbi Moshe was saying is that if it's a type of food that you cannot make at home, to that same degree of expertise, so consequently it doesn't apply. In other words, what Moshe is saying is that maybe similar to what Rabbi Klapper was mentioning earlier, that we're limiting the scope of the Isser to the types of food that could potentially be made at home, rather than just say prohibition no longer applies.
I hope I'm not, I don't think we're different in this, I didn't suggest that. Just that it's an example of sort of, through interpretation, sort of limiting the parameters of the Isser.
Although for the record, we should point out that major cash agencies are not currently classified like that.
No, I think I said I think that's not the practice. He says it's C.
Yes. That is correct. Do you want me to take on guest mission now, or why don't you take that? Okay. So I want to work with the theory I set out, and then I want to introduce one of my favorites. I think it's the Gemara reaches the conclusion that seems straightforward that we can have a conversion nowadays, even though we don't have genuine Musmachim, right, or genuine Mumchim. And since the word Mishpat appears in the context of Gerus, we should really, it should be impossible to have Gerus after the demise of real Smicha. So the question is, how do we have conversions? The Tosfos offers two answers, as I recall. The first is that we use this mechanism called Shlichus Sayed, exactly, Kamai Kavina. Right, where we are the constructive agents of the last Musmachim, right, at the moment, right, before the last Musmach, the last Bezin of Musmachim died, right, the sort of a Savash we want to continue what we're doing, all right, and that enables us to, to continue the work of the last Musmachim as their agents, because it's really as if they're doing it. The second possibility Tosfos gives, which in a sense is really contradictory with the first in a certain way, is that there's a pasuk that says that there are gerim lidorosei. And because there are gerim lidorosei, that's impossible to create a circumstance in which conversion is impossible. And since it's impossible to create a circumstance in which conversion is impossible, therefore it must be possible to do conversion without conversion. Now, as I say, the first argument undercuts the second, because you could say, no, that's not a problem, because you can use Shlichus Sayed. But Tosfos doesn't. Right, Tosfos doesn't seem to acknowledge that contradiction. So what I'm interested in is this notion that there are circumstances where you know what the halacha has to be, but you don't know what the right way of getting there is. What are you supposed to do in a circumstance where you know what the halacha is supposed to be, but you don't know how to get there? So there are at least two options. One possibility is to say, this is tragic. And I know this isn't supposed to be, but I'm stuck. And you can have this in the particular tragic way where you can say, you know what, it's not that I can't think of how to get there. I can think of 6 different ways to get there. And that means that each of these 6 ways, one of which I know is correct, only has a 17% chance of being correct. So I reject them all because there's a rule against each of them. There's another possibility, which is to say that since I have to eliminate the impossible, what remains, even if not probable, right, must be the truth. And so what I have to do is adopt the most likely remaining possibility. Okay, so now what I want to do is ask that question, the underlying question which I started at the beginning is it really possible that the intent of halakha is that if a group of the best, the spiritually attuned rabbis in the world made a decree, and for which that decree was formally no longer applied, not only that, it might be that that decree is now counterproductive. Is it really the intent of the halakha that we are completely stuck? You want to answer?
The simple answer might be yes, but I want to approach to explaining that particular situation. It's possible that in a theoretical sense we're not stuck, even though in a practical sense we are. So very briefly, for a long time I've sort of come to my own understanding, to understand the pattern of when you say that if the reason is buckled, Ezra doesn't apply, when do you say that Ezra applies anyway? For a long time I've had this sense, based upon the Mesrim and the other sources, and it turns out Moshe says something very similar in Yeshiva. I believe it's on the sources. Number 13. And I would present it as follows, and I'll depart a little lunges behind you too. I think that as a rule, whenever, even if the reason doesn't apply, the Ezra always applies. The only exceptions, there might be certain categories like things that are purely science or things like that maybe are exceptions. But when we're not talking about things that we might believe to be, let's say, scientific errors, the only time Ezra will be batela, if the reason doesn't apply, is always post facto. If the observant portion of Klal Yisrael, however you define that now, it might be different than once upon a time, no longer observes something, then the classic methodology of Rishonim and Achronim, except for maybe early Chachmei Sarah, like the Rambam especially, is to justify the annual practice that they can. And the way that is by saying that in this particular case, because the reason doesn't apply, the Ezra doesn't apply either. And that means that we don't have the capacity of course, to change anything, because first we all have to become Aryeh, violate the Ezra, and then in the subsequent generation somebody would say, oh, but the reason why the Ezra doesn't apply is the reason why we don't observe this is because since the reason doesn't apply, the Ezra doesn't apply. Now, why should that be, though, is an important question. And I think the answer is actually very straightforward. What makes much of Bavli binding, even though it's not officially a davar shebaminion? So the Rambam tells us basically, Klal Yisrael accepted. If Klal Yisrael in total, or some significant portion now turns around and says, we're not observing this anymore, in effect, that's the davar minyan, that's the minyan achar latiur. Moshe says it a little bit differently. Moshe says that if Klal Yisrael is no longer observing it, then we know if they were based on today, they would be mavaltal, so we don't even need it. It's yad dewas. Now, I would suggest that there is a way out, but none of us want this way out. The reason why it's so important, even though it's frustrating, that the entire Bavli be binding is because it's the only thing that Klal Yisrael in effect shares in common halacha. Sfardim, Ashkenazim, Teimanim may have many differences in halacha, but there's one common base that we share, which is the Talmud Bavli. The only way that it would be even conceivable that we would have a minyan achar latiro, and it has to be in effect, I'll take even Shabbat minyan, as the Rambam says, the minyan the Chachmei Hadar will agree to it. You would need all of Klal Yisrael to get together and say that we want to change this. Now, aside from the practical difficulties, as you can imagine, in doing that, I would just conclude, to be very, as you can imagine, we have difficulty agreeing actually about anything, unfortunately. Even things that should be obvious. A lot of things are not obvious, it's true. And a lot of things are complex, but even the obvious things, I think we could probably all agree that, that industrial visual atom should, really is not, there's no, the Tom that Ezra would apply there anymore. You pick your exam, I don't care what it is. However, putting aside the practical limitations, the practical ability to get people together, I think that as moderns who prize our own personal autonomy, we might actually be reluctant to give up to do that. And let me explain in very simple terms. Many of you are Balabatim in Mount Sinai, you have a Shaila, you go to Rabbi Schwartz. So Rabbi Schwartz gets to decide and answer your question. Maybe he talks to them, he talks to them, maybe he makes the decision on his own. Well, guess what? If we all get together and we have a central authority, so we might have more power and control over doing certain things, but it means that Rabbi Schwartz no longer has the power to decide many things, because guess what? If the central authority, in the way they see the world, has already decided a certain way, you stop. Rabbi Schwartz chooses to ignore them, eventually he can become Rabbi Klapper, Zakinam, maybe even a Gibor Hamsora, maybe as it goes. But in all seriousness, means that we sacrifice our autonomy, which I don't think most of us want to do. And maybe everybody would agree to that, but I'm not so sure. But putting aside whether we would want to do that or not, and whether we would be willing to sacrifice something which, for better or worse, probably both, that we sort of cherish on some level, putting aside that question, in order to be able to undo that which Klal Yisrael agreed to, so Klal Yisrael has to agree to undo. That only tends to happen. It only tends to happen when Klal Yisrael is already ignoring something. And so I think that while in principle we shouldn't have to be stuck with it, I think we're victims at the level of historical circumstances and of the choices that maybe we actually made.
So I actually just want to extend what Rabbi is saying possibly one step further. We'll foreshadow that Rabbi is not going to agree with the source, with my reading of the source that I'm going to bring you to. But what I'm going to try and do is say that everything I have said, we started the share with my quoting the Chazon, and I'm going to end by quoting Rabbi Ezra Menachem Shah, who I think has the most radically liberal position on this issue.
Can I just say, you actually believe that could possibly be true?
Yes. I'm wondering whether, the same way the Chazon, because he had different ways out of it. But the theoretical position underlying it is much more radical. So I want to read with you source number 11. Or at least I want you to look at it while I'm talking. We'll read some key lines. So way back in the very beginning, we talked about the RIETS position. And the RIETS position seemed to be, the way Rabbi Wieder explained it, that you need a Beit Din Gadol de Chachma of Minyan to overturn some kinds of Rabbanans, but other kinds of Rabbanans, the Rabbi says, we learned from the story of Rabbi and Zaka and Yitzhak Yerushalayim, of Minyan, or Vida says it requires some kind of other Minyan, and we are slipped in also a Beit Din Hagadol. or equivalent, right? Someone has minyan of the same stature. So Rav Shach, as I understand him, believes that it is utterly impossible that the Rabbi would suggest that the Rabbanans can be overturned by a lesser beit. This is inconceivable. Nobody could possibly have suggested the Rabbi would hold such a radical position. And therefore, Rav Shach comes to the position that the Rambam and the Rabbi agree that you always need a beit din gadol b'chachma minyan to overturn the Rabbanans. The Rabbi is just Cholik and goes further and thinks that there are some Rabbanans that not even a beit din gadol b'chachma minyan can overturn. But now he has to figure out, so what goes on in that story? In practice undoes it by there. So to this, Rav Shach has a fascinating solution. When he says this, if you look at the underlined section, he says, Nobody would suggest that a later beit din, lesser beit din, could overturn a previous zera. But a lesser beit din, later beit din, can make its own zera. Their own zera may have the consequence of banning the performance of the other zera. But you're not allowed to be mevatel, you're not allowed to be oker, but you are allowed to be mitaken. And here he says, the takana b'vadai she'af nezim kavim yachol l'taken. Certainly, a small beit din can make a takana. So, in fact, you can't overturn any drabbanans. All you have to do is make new ones. Now, then, the issue is, does this at least require a Sanhedrin? This is where Rabbi Wieder and I would disagree. Does it at least require a Sanhedrin? So he says, that the law, it cannot be harder to make a takana to overturn drabbanan to overturn the RIETS. Now, to the best claim that the only beit din that can make a takana to overturn the RIETS has to be a beit din gadol, that might itself be a dispute. If you assume that there are powers in other batei din to make takanot for the group over which they have authority, even if that means the suspension of a d'oraita, then it would seem to me that the same is true of the Rabbanans, that a local beit din having sufficient authority can make a decree that tells you not to keep that Rabbanan. For example, a beit din might think that the result of the decree against refuah is that people are getting sick. We don't want people sick. So we'll make a decree that it is asur not to treat people to the extent possible whenever you have it, whenever someone is ill. Now here I want to join Rabbi Wider's point. Let's suppose that I'm right, and that actually there is no actual restriction on making new halachot rabbanan so long as we frame them positively, as we have a rationale for making a new law, as opposed to saying that there is something wrong with the old law and that we're overturning it. Now, who has the authority to make a takana? People whom their population accepts as having the authority to make takanot. Which takanot? All the takanot they think are wise. Meaning that if you want someone to have the, let's say, my father is listening, so my father would like me to make it takana undoing Yom Tov Sheni. Many people, I think, I have my whatsoever in that. But then again, as people point out, I've never held a job outside the Orthodox tradition, well, outside the community that. But if you want to give me the authority to make decrees banning Yom Tov Sheni, so you also have to give me the authority to make whatever other decrees you might want. You might all find yourself having to read Paradise Lost once a month. And I think that not really, hitchhikers. But that would be looking popular, right? For people. But to me, the underlying question this raises is, I think really there are lots of mechanisms by which an empowered rabbinate could have significant effect on the nature of the law. But an empowered rabbinate is also empowered to do things that people disagree with. not things that people agree with. And it's ridiculous to say, well, you know what? We can take whatever laws you want. We'll just follow the ones we like. Right? That's not honest. So I want to suggest that that's a Rabbi Wieder puts it in terms of the autonomy of the individual layperson, or the individual rabbi relative to the whole community. I want to suggest that it really is can be a stark opinion relative just between any community, any current community, and its hypothetical authoritative rabbinate. That there isn't currently the level of trust necessary, and I'm not in any way saying undeservedly so, between the lay community and the rabbinate, that would enable an empowered rabbinate to take advantage of the capacities within the law. And part of it might be that people think that actually, if we gave the rabbi they wanted, they would not be shady. Right? And they would make other decrees or even less palatable. But I think that the core issue, as opposed to seeing it as a freezing of halacha, and there I think the key line at the end, the Ezra is, Lo adifa takanam rishonim midin Torah, which echoes the Rambam, or Rashi. There always has, right? They can't be that in practice, Rabbinic law is actually less flexible than biblical law. We have to say that underlying it really that is a fundamental lack of trust, which leads to a lack of authority between and the halachic scholars, and that rather than addressing specific issues, we really find a way to restore the underlying trust.
So first of all, I just want to thank the panelists. I think we actually got a mouthful to swallow in these last two comments. Before moving on to questions from the audience, I would just like to add my questions here to both panelists. First of all, we've been talking a lot about and when they no longer apply, we haven't really been focusing much that there are many times in every particular industrial bishul akum. Chazal are also going to one Rashi that bishul akum is because of Shabbat and the Davar Tamei, and how that would play into these conversations. And virtually every Gezerah Takana Minhag has a whole host of reasons. So it's very hard to isolate any particular issue. And could that not be the reason why we're reluctant to say that it doesn't apply? And it makes it a little more striking when you see poskim who say, in fact, it doesn't. That is the first point. The second point that I want to deal with is actually touching on what Rabbi Klapper said in his last comment, which is authority we give to rabbis and making laws. And in the Gemara itself, the Gemara says that there's a limit on rabbinic authority, that they can't make a gezerah she'ein bo hatzikir b'ma'alo. And in this Gemara, the real question, I think, is how often we evaluate that. Do we assume that once it was Yechol Mamo at the initial time that it was there forever, a certain right, we reevaluate whether that Gezerah still applies? That's just a question that I think is worth focusing on. The understanding of the Zohar that at first Rabbi Yehuda HaNassi tried to eradicate Shemen Sha'akom, and then Rabbi Yehuda Nasiya, his grandson, actually ended up doing it. So those are the 2 points that I wanted to mention, and then I think after the response, we'll move on to questions from the audience.
I'll just respond to the first question. I have multiple reasons. I don't know who says this. I heard it from Rabbi a long time ago. I thought I once saw the Meshachah, but I haven't been able to find it. That Zeros the Rabbanan have a sod also, and there's this nidla and this down, and therefore even if the nidla appears to be gone, we still have to observe because of the distance. The only, I think that solves the problem in a certain way, but my sense of reading the halakhic literature is that that's not the way poskim work. In other words, I'd be curious to find a situation where a posek has worked out a situation and he says, the reason where he says, oh, I was going to be accurate, except for that there was a sod. There might have been a sod, and I don't know what it is. In other words, it's just doesn't seem to be operative to reach those that they're thinking concerned about this reason. So I think that I think that there's a very valid line in power conundrum. I don't get the sense that it's about the literature. I could be wrong.
I have heard Bill ago that the reasons that were given out explicitly when the decree was first made were deliberately false. Since the rule was that any decree that the cut is based on the decrees they like, as opposed to the decrees they could keep. So they wouldn't tell them the real reason, so they couldn't decide whether they liked it or not. Right? That's another version of the same phenomenon. But I think it has very easy for people to attack. And we held really that there Shabbat just falls away. So then everybody decides for themselves what might happen. So I think we have a you can find out run us down also. Some people are very sure they understand the rationale. I know that. Some people aren't. In an environment where they feel that there's so much fundamental the authority of religious law that then really it's not really law, but because it has bad